At 10:17 on a grey Thursday morning, Dr. Margot Voss handed Caleb Turner a piece of chalk and tried to turn him into a joke. 20 minutes later, nobody inside Hawthorne University's old mathematics hall was laughing. Not the visiting professors, not the graduate assistants, not even Grant Hollis, the department chair who had spent the whole morning acting like Caleb was some kind of administrative mix-up. But the part nobody saw coming was what Dr. Voss did next, because she had built her entire career on one simple rule: never let a student make you look small in public. To understand how it got that far, you have to picture the room the way Caleb saw it that morning. Cold fluorescent lights, high windows streaked with rain, a blackboard that still had pale white ghost marks from problems nobody had fully erased, and more than 100 students sitting too straight in their chairs because everybody knew Dr. Voss had a reputation. She was the kind of professor people warned you about before registration, not because she was unfair exactly, but because she treated confusion like a moral failure. Ask a question at the wrong moment, and she could make you regret having a voice. Fall behind her one lecture, and she would look at you like you had personally wasted the university's money. The class was called Applied Analysis and Differential Systems, which sounded harmless enough on a catalog page, but students who had taken it called it the Dropout Factory. Caleb had heard that nickname before he ever walked through the door, and honestly, part of him liked it. He had spent most of his life being told that hard things were not meant for him, so a class that scared everybody else felt less like a warning and more like a dare. Caleb was 25, older than most students in the room, and he did not look like the kind of person Hawthorne University liked to put in brochures. He wore work boots, even on campus, because he still helped his uncle at an auto repair shop on weekends. He carried a backpack with one broken zipper that he kept fixing with a safety pin, and he had transferred in from a community college 2 counties away after spending 3 years working nights at a warehouse. Some people saw all that and assumed they knew his story. They saw a black man in a faded brown jacket sitting in an advanced mathematics course and decided he was probably there by accident. Caleb had learned a long time ago that people were very confident about things they had never bothered to understand. He grew up in a small town outside Dayton, in a house where money was always tight, but curiosity was never treated like a luxury. His mother drove a school bus, his uncle fixed engines, and his grandfather used to keep a notebook full of baseball statistics, weather patterns, grocery receipts, and strange little equations nobody in the family understood. Caleb was 11 when he first noticed that numbers could tell the truth in a way people sometimes could not. A car either started or it did not. A bolt either fit or it strict. A measurement either held up under pressure or it failed. There was something honest about that, something clean. By the time he got to high school, he was solving problems teachers had not assigned because he liked the quiet that came when everything finally clicked into place. But life did what life does. His mother got sick for a while. He took a job. College got pushed back, then pushed back again, and by the time he finally enrolled at Riverbend Community College, he was already used to being the oldest guy in the room, and the one people assumed had missed his chance. Still, Caleb kept going. He took night classes, studied during lunch breaks, watched free lectures online at 2 in the morning, and wrote formulas on the backs of shipping labels when the warehouse was slow. By the time a professor at Riverbend told him to apply to Hawthorne, Caleb had already learned not to get too excited about doors opening. He knew some doors only opened halfway, just enough for people to watch and see whether you tripped coming through. That Thursday was supposed to be an open lecture, which meant Dr. Voss would teach while senior faculty, donors, and department representatives watched from the front rows. Hawthorne called it an academic showcase. The students called it a gladiator match with whiteboards. Dr. Fear. Voss had been selected because she was one of the department's stars, published, respected, feared, and very good at making difficult material look effortless. She came in exactly on time, silver hair pinned tight at the back of her head, dark green blazer, thin glasses, leather folder tucked under one arm. She did not smile, not because she had forgotten how, but because smiling would have suggested she needed anyone in that room to like her. The front row had already filled with faculty members. Grant Hollis sat near the aisle in a navy suit, hands folded over a gold watch, wearing the sort of expression men wear when they believe they own the room, even when their name is not on the door. Hollis had been at Hawthorne for nearly 30 years. He had helped build the department's reputation, raised money, hired faculty, and made a small fortune making sure everyone knew exactly how important he was. He was not openly cruel, not usually. He was worse than that. He was polite in a way that made you feel like he had already filed you into a category and decided how much attention you deserved. Caleb had met him once during orientation. Hollis had glanced at Caleb's transfer paperwork, paused at the name of the community college, then said, "Well, Hawthorne is a big jump, Mr. Turner. I hope you are prepared for the pace." Caleb had smiled and said, "I guess we'll both find out." Hollis had not smiled back. Sitting beside him was Dr. Voss, who had her own reasons for guarding that classroom like a fortress. Years earlier, when she was a young professor, older men in the department had dismissed her work, talked over her in meetings, and treated her like a temporary guest in a field they believed to them. She had fought her way up through every one of them. But somewhere along the way, surviving that system had turned into protecting it. She no longer saw cruelty as cruelty. She saw it as rigor. She had convinced herself that pressure made people stronger. And maybe sometimes it did, but it also made a lot of people disappear. Caleb did not know all of that yet. He just knew she had looked at him twice during the first week of class, and both times her eyes had lingered a second too long, like she was trying to figure out what he was doing there. Dr. Voss began the lecture without greeting anyone. She wrote a long expression across the board, a boundary value problem that folded into a transform method, then started moving through the steps at a pace that made half the class panic before they had even opened their notebooks. Keys clicked, pens scratched. Somebody in the back dropped a calculator, and the sound felt louder than it should have because nobody was breathing normally. Caleb watched the board. He was not taking notes yet, not because he thought he was above it, but because he had learned that when a problem first appears, you need to understand its shape before you start copying its clothes. Dr. Voss explained the first transformation, moved to the next line, and then stopped when a young woman near the aisle raised her hand. Her name was Priya Shah, a junior from Illinois, one of those students who always arrived early and sat in the front with color-coded notebooks. Caleb had seen her answer questions before. She was smart, careful, and terrified of disappointing people. Dr. Voss turned toward her slowly. "Yes," Priya swallowed. "I may be missing something, but when you move the initial term across, shouldn't the boundary condition still be carried into the next step?" For half a second, the room was quiet. Then Dr. Voss gave a small smile, the kind that did not reach her eyes. "You may be missing quite a few things, Miss Promile." "Sure," she said. A few people stared down at their desks. Priya's face went red. Dr. Voss turned back to the board. "If you do not understand the assumption, do not interrupt the derivation. We can discuss remedial questions of the class." It was not loud. That was the thing about Dr. Voss. She did not have to raise her voice to hurt someone. Priya lowered her hand and stopped writing for a few seconds. Caleb watched her grip her pen, then watched Dr. Voss continue as if nothing had happened. And that was when he saw it. Not the same thing Priya had noticed, but close. Same thing Priya had noticed, but close. Voss had not just moved too quickly. She had written a step that only worked if a certain condition was true, and she had not established that condition. In plain English, she had used a shortcut before proving she was allowed to use it. It was a small error on the surface, the kind most people in the room would never catch because the symbols still looked elegant, still looked complicated, still looked like something you were supposed to trust because a famous professor had written it. But if the assumption was wrong, the rest of the solution would collapse later. Caleb looked down at his notebook, then back at the board. He checked the line again. Once, twice, 3 times. The answer did not change. He knew he was right. The problem was that being right and speaking up were not always the same thing. He could feel the room around him, the quiet fear, the faculty in the front, the cold little smiles from people who already thought he did not belong there. He could keep his head down. He could let Dr. Voss finish. He could wait until after class and maybe mention it privately if he was feeling generous. But Caleb had spent too much of his life watching people with authority get away with being careless just because everyone else was afraid to embarrass them. He remembered his mother once coming home upset because a supervisor had blamed her for a route change that was clearly not her fault. He remembered asking why she did not fight it. She had looked tired, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Baby, sometimes you save your strength for the fights that can actually change something." Caleb had never forgotten that. He also remembered what she said next. "But when the truth is right in front of you, do not ever help a lie get comfortable." So Caleb raised his hand. You could almost feel the air leave the room. Dr. Voss kept writing for another second, then turned, chalk still between her fingers. "Yes, Mr. Turner." Caleb sat up straighter. "There is a problem in the transformation," he said. The room went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that feels physical, like the whole place had leaned forward at once. Dr. Voss blinked once. "A problem." Caleb nodded. "The boundary term is being treated as if the initial condition is already fixed, but it has not been established yet. If you carry that assumption into the next line, the solution only works for one special case. Somebody near the front let out a tiny breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Grant Hollis leaned back in his chair. There it is, Caleb thought, the moment they had been waiting for. Dr. Voss looked at the board, then back at him. Her voice softened, which was never a good sign. "Are you certain?" Caleb did not look away. "Yes, ma'am." Beside Hollis, an older professor named Carl Whitmore leaned over and whispered something that made Hollis smile. Caleb could not hear the words, but he did not need to. The tone said enough. "Doctor not hear the words?" Voss walked to the spot on the board where the error sat, small and innocent-looking, surrounded by clean lines of chalk. She studied it for a few seconds. Then she turned around again. "Mr. Turner," she said, "there is a difference between noticing something unusual and understanding why it is there." Caleb waited. She stepped aside and held out the chalk. "So why don't you come show us the difference?" A few students shifted in their seats. Priya looked up for the first time since being shut down. Grant Hollis crossed one leg over the other and watched Caleb with the patient expression of a man waiting for a bad decision to reveal itself. Dr. Voss did not look angry. That would have been easier. She looked almost amused, like she had just opened a door and was inviting Caleb to walk through it without telling him there was no floor on the other side. Caleb stood slowly. His chair made a soft scrape against the tile, and somehow that tiny sound seemed to echo through the whole hall. He walked toward the board with 100 pairs of eyes on him, passing Priya, passing the rows of students who had spent the semester learning to be afraid, passing Grant Hollis and his expensive watch and his little satisfied smile. When Caleb took the chalk from Dr. Rada, Voss's hand, her fingers did not shake, neither did his. But as he turned to face the board, he heard someone in the front row whisper, barely loud enough to catch, "This should be interesting." Caleb looked at the equation, then at the empty space beneath it, and for the first time that morning he smiled. Not because he thought this would be easy, not because he wanted revenge. He smiled because he wanted revenge. He smiled because he finally understood what they had all missed. They thought they had called him to the board to prove he did not belong there. They had no idea they had just handed him the stage. Caleb stood at the board for a moment without writing, not because he was stuck, but because he could feel every eye in the room trying to decide what kind of story this was going to be. Dr. Margot Voss stood 3 feet behind him with her arms folded, calm as a judge. Grant Hollis sat in the front row with that little half smile still hanging on his face. And Carl Whitmore had stopped pretending to take notes because apparently watching someone get humiliated was more entertaining than differential systems. Caleb looked at the equation again, then picked up the chalk and erased one narrow section of the board. The sound was soft, almost nothing, but it changed the temperature in the room. He did not rush. That was the first thing people noticed. Most students rushed when Dr. Voss put them on the spot. They wrote too fast, talked too much, made one nervous mistake and then another, until she could take over and make it look like she had rescued them from themselves. Caleb did not give her that opening. He rewrote the assumption, carried the boundary term through the transform the way it was supposed to go, then stopped and tapped the chalk lightly against the board. "If we want to use the shortcut from the previous line," he said, "we have to prove this condition first. Otherwise, the solution only works when the initial value is 0, and the problem never says that it is." Nobody moved. Caleb kept going, his voice even, not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough that the students in the back could follow him. "So instead of dropping the term here, we keep it, solve the transformed expression, and only then apply the condition." He wrote the final line, stepped back, and looked at Dr. Voss. "That gives us the general solution." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt longer than most meetings Caleb had ever sat through. Priya looked from the board to her notes, then back again. A guy in the second row quietly crossed out half a page. One of the visiting professors leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. Dr. Voss studied the equation with the kind of focus people use when they are looking for a crack in ice they have already started walking across. Caleb watched her face without expecting much. He did not need an apology. He did not even need her to admit he was right. He just needed the math to hold up. And it did. Finally, Dr. Voss gave a short nod. Technically correct, she said. It was not praise. It was not even close. But in that room, coming from her, it landed like a small earthquake. Grant Hollis shifted in his chair. Carl Whitmore stopped smiling. Caleb set the chalk down in the tray and started back toward his seat. But before he could get there, Dr. Voss turned to the board again. Interesting, she said. Then she picked up a fresh piece of chalk. Since Mr. Turner appears to have found the first example a little too familiar, perhaps we should try something less forgiving. A few students looked at each other. Caleb paused beside his desk. He knew that tone. It was not curiosity. It was damage control. Dr. Nugasiti. Voss began raising a second problem, longer than the first, built around coupled differential equations, transform operators, and a nasty non-linear term she tucked into the middle like a tripwire. It was the kind of problem that makes people feel tired before they even start, the kind that looks less like math and more like a legal document written by someone who hates you. By the time she finished, the board was crowded with symbols. Dr. Voss put the chalk down and looked directly at Caleb. "You may take your seat, Mr. Turner," she said, "or you may continue." Caleb glanced at the problem. His stomach tightened, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood exactly what she was doing. She was raising the stakes in front of an audience. If he refused, she could call it restraint. If he failed, she could call it proof. If he succeeded, well, she probably had another trap waiting behind it. Caleb thought of his grandfather's old notebook, of all those numbers tucked between grocery lists and weather reports. His grandfather used to say, "Never be scared of a hard problem, son. Be scared of the easy lie someone hands you because they think you will not look close enough." Caleb set his backpack down beside his chair. "I will continue," he said. This time, nobody laughed. Dr. Voss stepped aside. Caleb walked back to the board. He read the problem from top to bottom, then once more from the non-linear term upward. He could hear rain tapping against the windows. Somewhere in the building, a heater kicked on with a low metal groan. Grant Hollis cleared his throat. Carl Whitmore checked his phone, then checked the board again because even he could tell something was happening. Caleb began with the system structure, not the transform. That was the trick. Most people would attack the equations one line at a time, get tangled up in the terms, and spend 20 minutes trying to clean up a mess they had made in the first two. Caleb saw the symmetry buried underneath it. He separated the variables, reframed the coupling, and reduced the ugly middle section into something almost embarrassingly simple. Not easy, exactly, but clean. As his chalk moved, the whispers behind him began to fade. Priya leaned forward. A graduate assistant near the wall stopped typing. Someone in the back said, "Wait," under his breath. Caleb did not look around. He had learned how dangerous it was to depend on a room's approval. People could give it to you 1 minute and take it back the next, usually right after you got comfortable, so he stayed with the work. One line led to the next, then the next, and after 7 minutes, he wrote the final expression at the bottom of the board. He stood there looking at it, checking for any sign that he had rushed a step. There was none. Dr. Voss walked closer. Caleb moved aside so she could inspect it. She did not say anything at first. Her glasses reflected the board, and for a second, Caleb could not see her eyes. Then Priya spoke from the front row, barely louder than a whisper. "That is right." Dr. Voss turned toward her. Priya swallowed, but this time she did not lower her gaze. I think it is right," she said. "I worked on a similar system last semester. The reduction is valid if the coefficient condition is preserved, and he preserved it." A few heads turned toward Priya. Caleb felt something shift, not in the equation, but in the room itself. Dr. meant the equation, but in the room itself. Voss had spent years teaching students that being wrong was dangerous. Caleb had spent 10 minutes proving that maybe speaking up was not always a mistake. Dr. Voss looked back at the board. Then, very quietly, she said, "Yes, it is correct." That should have been the end of it. In a normal classroom, a professor might have said "good work," or explained the key insight, or maybe used the moment to encourage everyone else. But Dr. Voss was not interested in letting a normal classroom happen. She picked up her leather folder, walked to her desk, and opened a thick grey textbook that Caleb had only seen graduate students carry. The spine was cracked, the pages were crowded with handwritten notes, and when she flicked toward the back, the students around Caleb started murmuring again. Grant Hollis leaned forward. Carl Whitmore looked pleased, like he had just remembered the movie had one more act. Dr. Voss placed the book on the front table and turned it so Caleb could see the page. "This," she said, "is from a doctoral qualifying exam. Not from Hawthorne, from the East Coast Institute. It has not been assigned in this course, and I do not expect anyone in this room to solve it." Caleb looked at the page. The problem was not impossible, but it was mean. It involved a functional equation, a stability condition, and a proof structure that required more than calculation. You had to see the idea before you could touch the numbers. Dr. Voss rested one hand on the book. "You have already made your point, Mr. Turner. You may return to your seat." There it was, finally, the exit she had not offered before. Caleb could walk away. He had corrected her. He had solved the harder problem. He had made the room reconsider him. A smarter person might have taken the win and sat down. But Caleb knew the look on Grant Hollis's face. He knew what people like Hollis did with unfinished stories. They filled the blank space with whatever made them comfortable. He will crack under real pressure. He got lucky. He knew one trick. He is good, but not that good. Caleb looked at the doctoral problem. Then he looked at Doss. "You said you do not expect anyone to solve it," he said. "Correct. Then why bring it out?" A few students sucked in a breath. Dr. Voss's expression tightened just slightly. "Because I am interested in seeing where your confidence ends." Caleb nodded. "Fair enough." He walked toward the book. Grant Hollis finally spoke, his voice smooth and low. "Mr. Turner," he said, "this is not a performance." Caleb looked at him. "No, sir, it is not. That is probably why it makes some people uncomfortable." The room went dead quiet again. Hollis stared at him for a second, and Caleb could see the surprise in his eyes. Not outrage, surprise. Men like Hollis expected people to either shrink or explode. They did not know what to do with someone who spoke plainly and stayed calm. Dr. Voss pushed the book closer. Caleb took out a clean sheet of paper, read the problem, and sat at the front table instead of going back to the board. He did not want to perform it. He wanted to think. For the first minute, nothing happened. His pencil hovered over the page. The students watched him the way people watch a tightrope walker, half hoping he makes it, half unable to look away if he falls. Dr. Voss stood near the desk. Hollis watched the clock. Carl Whitmore had that same little smile again, though it had less confidence in it now. Caleb read the problem a second time, then a third. The first approach was ugly. Too many cases, too much room for error. He scratched it out. The second approach was better, but it relied on a proof that would take too long. He could feel the old pressure rising in his chest, the familiar voice that used to show up when life got hard enough. Maybe they were right. Maybe this is where you stop. Maybe you came too far too fast. He hated that voice because it sounded reasonable. Fear usually did. Then he remembered something his uncle used to say at the garage whenever an engine would not turn over. "Do not keep punching the same dead spot, kid. Step back and find out what you are missing." Caleb looked at the equation again, but this time he did not look at it as a proof problem. He looked at it as a pattern. There, a hidden invariance, not obvious, but once he saw it, the rest of the structure opened up. Caleb started writing. 10 minutes passed, then 15. His hand cramped, but he kept going. He introduced the substitution, established the condition, and built the proof from the inside out. The math was not flashy. That was the beautiful part. It was simple in the way a good repair is simple, once someone finally understands what is broken. When Caleb finished, he set his pencil down and slid the page toward Dr. Voss. She picked it up, read the first line, then the second. Her face did not change much, but her silence did. Carl Whitmore leaned toward Grant Hollis. Hollis did not lean back. One of the visiting professors stood and came closer without asking. He was a thin man with a red tie and a tired face, someone Caleb had not noticed before. He took the page from Dr. Voss gently, read it, then read it again. "Who taught you to think like this?" he asked. Caleb looked at him. Nobody, really. The man gave a small laugh, not mocking, just amazed. "That is the problem," he said. "You're not supposed to be able to do this without somebody teaching you how. Caleb shrugged. Maybe nobody told the problem that. For the first time all morning, somebody laughed in a way that did not make Caleb feel smaller. It started with Priya, a nervous little laugh that broke through the tension. Then a few others joined in. Even the visiting professor smiled. Dr. Voss did not. She stood very still, holding the proof in her hands, and Caleb could see the war going on behind her expression. She had wanted to expose him. Instead, she had exposed herself not as incompetent, not exactly, but as someone who had stopped seeing students as people capable of surprising her. She placed the paper on the desk. "That is a valid proof," she said. Caleb nodded once. "Thank you. The class should have ended there. Everyone knew it." But Dr. Voss was not ready to let the moment settle into something she could not control. She closed the grey textbook, straightened her folder, and walked to the center of the room. "Mr. Turner," she said, "there is an event next month called the National Meridian Challenge." Caleb had heard of it. Everybody in advanced math had. It was a 3-round competition held in Philadelphia every spring, with teams and individual contestants from universities all over the country. The best students from schools with names that carried weight in every academic hallway, places like Stanford, MIT, Princeton, and Caltech. Winning it meant research offers, fellowships, invitations, the kind of opportunities that could change a person's life before they turned 30. It was also brutal. Most competitors prepared for months. Some trained for years. Caleb had watched highlights from it online once, mostly out of curiosity, and had told himself it was not his world. Dr. Voss continued, "Hawthorne has one individual invitation remaining. I had intended to offer it to a graduate student." Grant Hollis looked at her sharply. "Margot," he said. She ignored him. "But perhaps," she said, "Mr. Turner has earned the chance to test his abilities in a setting with less familiarity and more consequence." Caleb understood the words beneath the words. "You think you are special? Go stand next to people who are born for this and see what happens." The class began whispering. Priya looked excited. Carl Whitmore looked almost delighted. Grant Hollis looked angry now, not because he cared about Caleb's chances, but because Dr. Voss was making a decision in front of everyone without his permission. Caleb felt his pulse in his throat. The invitation was real. So was the trap. If he lost, people like Hollis would forget everything that happened that morning. They would call the whole thing a nice little campus story. They would say he had courage, which was a polite word people used when they wanted to avoid saying you were outmatched. If he won, well, Caleb did not even let himself go there. Dr. Voss looked at him. "You do not need to answer now." Caleb looked at the board, at the corrected equations still written in chalk. He thought about his mother driving before sunrise, his uncle's hands blackened with oil, his grandfather's notebook, Priya sitting in the front row, finally looking like she had remembered she was allowed to ask questions. Then he looked back at Dr. Voss. "I will answer now," he said. Grant Hollis exhaled through his nose. Caleb kept his eyes on Dr. Voss. "I will compete." The room exploded into whispers. Dr. Voss blinked once. "No hesitation," she said. Caleb gave a small smile. "No hesitation," she said. Caleb gave a small smile. "You already taught us what happens when you hesitate." For the first time that day, Dr. Voss had no answer. The next 4 weeks were not glamorous. Nobody made a movie montage out of the hours Caleb spent alone in the basement library with stale vending machine coffee and a stack of practice packets taller than his backpack. Nobody saw the way he came in before dawn, when the campus was still dark and the only people awake were security guards, janitors, and students with something to prove. Nobody saw him rub his eyes until they burned, then keep working. Nobody saw the nights when a problem beat him for 3 hours straight and he had to walk outside into the cold just to remind himself he still had a body. But that was where the real change happened. Caleb did not study to impress Dr. Voss. He did not study to make Grant Hollis uncomfortable. He studied because for the first time in his life, the thing he had always felt quietly inside him was standing in front of a real door, and he did not want to be the one who failed to walk through it. Priya started joining him in the library after her afternoon classes. At first, she said she was only there because she had fallen behind in applied analysis. Then one night, around 11:30, she pushed a cup of coffee toward him and said, "I am not here because I'm behind." Caleb looked up. She smiled a little. "I am here because somebody has to make sure you eat something besides peanut butter crackers." Caleb laughed. "That is fair." Priya became the kind of friend who did not make a big speech about helping. She just showed up. She brought him notes from other classes, checked his practice work when he was too tired to see obvious mistakes, and reminded him that rest was not the same thing as quitting. In return, Caleb helped her rebuild the confidence Dr. Voss had chipped away at. When Priya got stuck, he never said, "You should know this." He said, "Show me where it stopped making sense." It was a small difference, but it changed the way she learned. One evening, Grant Hollis found Caleb in the library. It was nearly midnight. The building was quiet except for the hum of old lights and the whisper of pages turning. Hollis stood at the end of the table in the same navy suit he had worn that morning weeks earlier, as if he had been born in it. "You are working hard," he said. Caleb did not look up from the problem set. "So I have been told." Hollis pulled out the chair across from him, but did not sit. "The Meridian Challenge is not a classroom exercise. The competitors you will face have access to resources you have not had. Coaches, research teams, private preparation." Caleb looked up then. "Is that supposed to scare me? It is supposed to make you realistic?" Caleb leaned back. "Realistic is fine. People use it like it means the same thing as small, though." Hollis's jaw tightened. "I am trying to save you from public embarrassment." "No," Caleb said. "You were trying to save yourself from being publicly wrong twice." Hollis stared at him. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You saw me in that classroom," he continued. "You saw the proof. You saw the board. And you still came in here hoping I would talk myself out of competing. Because somewhere in your head, it is easier to believe I am reckless than to believe you misjudged me." Hollis looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Confidence can become arrogance very quickly." Caleb smiled, tired but steady. "I will keep an eye on it. You should too." Hollis left without another word. Caleb watched him go, then looked down at the page in front of him. His hands were shaking a little. Not from fear exactly, from the strange exhaustion of standing up to someone who had spent years making other people feel like they needed permission to exist. The morning of the Meridian Challenge came cold and bright. Philadelphia looked silver through the hotel window, all stone buildings and traffic and people moving like they had somewhere important to be. Caleb stood in the lobby wearing the only suit he owned, charcoal grey, a little tight at the shoulders because he had bought it 2 years earlier for his mother's church anniversary. Priya had helped him pick out a blue tie the night before, telling him it made him look like somebody who knew what he was doing. Caleb had told her he did know what he was doing. She had said, "Great, then now you will look like it too." Dr. Moundier. Voss arrived 10 minutes later with Grant Hollis and Carl Whitmore. Nobody said much. Dr. Voss handed Caleb his registration badge. His name sat under the Hawthorne University logo in clean black letters. Caleb Turner. Individual competitor. He held it for a second before clipping it to his jacket. Around him, contestants from schools he had only seen in articles and documentaries moved through the lobby in small groups, talking about proofs, advisors, and problems they had solved before breakfast, like it was normal conversation. A few of them glanced at Caleb's badge, then at Hawthorne, then away. One tall guy in a black coat looked at him and asked, "You with the graduate team?" Caleb shook his head. "Individual entry." The guy gave a quick laugh. "Brave." Caleb met his eyes. "I have been called worse." "Brave." Caleb met his eyes. "I have been called worse." Then the doors to the competition hall opened. The room beyond was huge, tiered, bright, and full of people who looked like they had never once expected to be underestimated. At the front, a massive screen glowed above the judges' table. Dr. Voss took her seat with the faculty observers. Grant Hollis sat 2 chairs away, hands folded tightly in his lap. Carl Whitmore looked toward Caleb and gave him a thin smile, like he was still waiting for the universe to put everything back in its proper order. Caleb walked to his assigned desk near the center of the room. He set down his pencils, straightened his paper, and looked once toward the screen. A voice came through the speakers. "Welcome to the final round of the National Meridian Challenge." Caleb took a slow breath. For a long time, people had looked at him and seen a man standing outside the door. Now the door was open, the room was watching, and the first problem was about to appear. The first problem appeared on the screen, and for a second the entire hall seemed to lean toward it at once. It was a long one, built around an unstable boundary condition, and a transform that looked straightforward until you noticed the parameter shift buried halfway through the setup, the kind of trap that punished anybody who started writing before they had really read what was in front of them. Around Caleb, pencils began moving almost immediately. He heard chairs creak, paper slide. Someone near the front let out a breath through their teeth, then everything narrowed down to the problem and the steady hum of the lights above him. Caleb did not write right away. He sat still, one hand resting beside the page, and let the structure settle in his head. Back at Hawthorne, people had mistaken his silence for hesitation. They had done it so often that by now it almost made him laugh. Caleb was not slow because he did not know what to do. He was slow because he had learned that the first answer your mind throws at you is often the answer designed to embarrass you. He read the condition again, followed the term through the system, and saw it. The problem was not asking for brute force. It was asking whether you could recognize that the instability disappeared when the equation was viewed from a different angle. Caleb wrote one clean substitution, then another. Across the aisle, a contestant from Stanford scratched out an entire page. Somewhere behind him, a pencil snapped. Caleb kept going. The first round lasted 40 minutes. By the end, a few contestants were still writing frantically, but Caleb had finished with 6 minutes left. He did not look around for a reaction. He checked his work once, folded his hands, and waited. When time was called, the judges collected the papers in silence. Grant Hollis watched Caleb from the faculty section with his mouth set tight, like he had bitten into something unpleasant and was determined not to let anyone see it. Dr. Voss sat beside him perfectly still, but Caleb noticed the small movement of her thumb against the edge of her program. It was the only sign that she was nervous. Carl Whitmore, however, looked almost cheerful. He leaned toward Hollis and said something that made Hollis nod once, slowly. Caleb could not hear it, but he did not need to. There were only so many ways a man like Whitmore could talk about a kid from a community college sitting among polished contestants from schools that had their own buildings named after dead billionaires. The first round results were projected 20 minutes later. 40 competitors became 20. Caleb's name was on the board, 6th from the top. A few heads turned. Not many, but enough. The tall guy in the black coat from the lobby was standing near the water station when Caleb walked past, and he looked at the screen, then at Caleb. "Nice start," he said. Caleb nodded. "You too." The guy held out his hand. "Nolan Mercer, Eastbridge Institute." Caleb shook it. "Caleb Turner, Hawthorne." Nolan looked at the Hawthorne badge again, not rudely this time, more carefully. "You, the transfer student everybody was talking about." Caleb smiled. "Depends who everybody is." Nolan gave a short laugh. "Fair. I heard you got in through an individual invitation. That usually means somebody upstairs thinks you are either very good or very stubborn." Caleb glanced toward the faculty section, where Hollis was still sitting with his hands folded over that gold watch. "Probably both," he said. Nolan was not like Hollis or Whitmore. Caleb could tell that much right away. Nolan had the smooth confidence of someone who had been trained for rooms like this, but he did not carry it like a weapon. He carried it like a coat he had worn so long he barely noticed it was there. He had grown up around professors. Caleb later learned his father taught economics at Eastbridge, his mother worked in a research lab, and he had been solving competition problems since he was 12. To Nolan, this world was familiar. To Caleb, it still felt like he had wandered into the wrong building and decided not to leave. The second round began after lunch, and the problems got harder fast. The first one involved the proof by contradiction that twisted halfway through into a question about convergence. The second required finding a hidden symmetry inside a system that looked deliberately ugly. The third was worse, a nonlinear equation that seemed to have too many variables until he realized one of them was not really independent at all. Caleb worked through each one slowly enough to stay accurate and fast enough to keep moving. Every time doubt tried to creep in, he pushed it back to where it belonged. Not ignored, not denied, just put in its proper place. He remembered his first year at Riverbend Community College, sitting in the parking lot before an exam, because he was convinced he was about to fail. His old professor, Dr. Elaine Porter, had found him there with a coffee in one hand and a stack of notes in the other. She had sat beside him on the curb and said, "Caleb, nerves do not mean you are unprepared. They mean you care about the outcome. Do not let them trick you into thinking they are in charge." He had carried that sentence with him ever since. By the end of the second round, only 8 contestants remained. Caleb was one of them. Nolan Mercer was another. So was a woman from Princeton named Lila Chen, who had a reputation for solving proof problems in ways that made professors angry because she always found a shorter path than the one they expected. There was also a graduate student from MIT named Owen Hale, quiet, sharp, and visibly annoyed that Caleb was still in the room. Owen had not said anything directly, but Caleb had caught the look more than once. It was not hatred. It was something colder, It was the look of a man who believed the world had rules and who did not like seeing someone else succeed without following the version of those rules he understood. During the break before the final round, Priya called Caleb from the hallway outside the competition room. He stepped away from the crowd and answered on the second ring. "You alive?" she asked. "Barely," Caleb said. "I have had easier Saturdays." Priya laughed, then went quiet for a moment. "You are in the top 8. I know. That is ridiculous." Caleb leaned against the wall and looked through the glass doors at the competition hall. "No," he said. "It is surprising. There is a difference." "Okay, Mr. Philosophy," Priya said. "Just remember to eat the sandwich I put in your bag." Caleb looked down. "You put a sandwich in my bag." Caleb looked down. "You put a sandwich in my bag. Turkey and Swiss," she said. "Do not act like you are too good for lunch now that you are competing with the math royalty." Caleb smiled. "You know, if this thing does not work out, you could make a career out of bossing people around." Priya made a small sound. "I have been thinking about it." Then her voice softened. "Caleb, whatever happens in there, you already did something nobody can take away from you. You made people at Hawthorne look at themselves." He knew what she meant. He also knew she was trying to help, but some part of him still resisted the comfort of it, because there was a difference between changing one room and changing the thing that room represented. Caleb looked through the glass again. Dr. Voss was sitting alone at the judges' table, reading through a packet. Hollis was standing behind her, talking low and fast. Whitmore had joined them. Their body language said enough. There was an argument happening, but not one Caleb could hear. He watched Dr. Voss close the packet, stand up and say something to Hollis that made him stop talking. Then she looked across the hall and saw Caleb watching. For a second, neither of them moved. Caleb had expected her to look away. Instead, she walked toward him. Priya was still talking through the phone. "Caleb, are you there?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "I have to go." "Tell me what happens," she said. "I have to go." "Tell me what happens," she said. "I will." He ended the call just as Dr. Voss reached him. Up close, she looked more tired than she had in class. Not weak, not defeated, just tired in a way Caleb had not seen before. The kind of tired that comes from realizing you have spent years fighting one kind of injustice only to become comfortable with another. She stopped a few feet away. "You are doing well," she said. Caleb almost laughed. "That is about as close to praise as I am going to get, huh?" Her mouth moved like she nearly smiled, but the expression never fully arrived. Perhaps. Caleb waited. Dr. Voss looked toward the room, then back at him. "Hollis wants you to withdraw before the final round." Caleb stared at her. "Why?" "He says the department has already made its point," she said. "That is not a reason." "No," Caleb said. "It is not." She lowered her voice. "He believes the attention is becoming disruptive." Caleb let out one breath, slow and controlled. Disruptive. That word had followed him around in different forms his whole life. Too direct, too loud, too proud, too angry, too ambitious. The thing was, people only called you disruptive when your presence interrupted a system that had been comfortable without you. "So what did you say?" Caleb asked. Dr. Voss met his eyes. "I told him it was not his decision." Caleb did not speak for a moment. He had spent weeks expecting her to make the next move against him. The fact that she had stepped in, even slightly, made him more uncomfortable than he expected. Because forgiveness was easy when people stayed simple. It was harder when they showed you a crack in the wall. Dr. Voss took a breath. "I was wrong about you, Caleb." He had imagined that moment before. In his head it came with an apology, maybe even regret. But standing there in the hallway, with the final round waiting and the noise of the competition drifting around them, he realized he did not need a perfect speech from her. He only needed the truth. She continued, "I thought I was testing whether you could handle pressure, but I was really protecting my own authority. Those are not the same thing." Caleb nodded slowly. "No, they are not." She looked down at the floor. "I spent years fighting to be taken seriously in rooms full of men who assumed I was less capable than they were. Somewhere along the way, I started believing that the only way to survive was to make sure nobody got close enough to challenge me. I told myself I was building standards, but standards without fairness are just walls." Caleb did not know what to say to that, so he said the honest thing. "You hurt people." Dr. Voss looked back up. "I know. Priya too, I know." "And you do not get to fix it with one sentence," Caleb said. "I know that too." There was something about the way she said it that made him believe her. Not completely, not enough to erase what happened, but enough to understand that the story had changed for both of them. An announcement came over the speakers, calling finalists back to the hall. Dr. Voss stepped aside. Caleb started toward the doors, then paused. "Dr. Voss." She looked at him. "You were right about one thing." "What is that?" "Real pressure does show people who they are." He walked away before she could answer. The final round had only one problem. That was how the Meridian Challenge worked. One question, 90 minutes, no calculators, no outside material, no second chances. The judges called it the synthesis problem because it was designed to pull together everything the contestants had studied: analysis, algebra, differential systems, probability, proof logic, and intuition. The students called it something less polite. Caleb sat at his desk as the screen went dark. Across from him, Nolan Mercer adjusted his glasses and rolled his shoulders. Lila Chen stared at the blank screen with both hands folded under her chin. Owen Hale sat perfectly still, face unreadable. Above them, the judges took their seats. Dr. Voss was there. Hollis was not. Caleb noticed that right away. There was an empty chair near the end of the faculty row, and somehow that absence told him more than a speech would have. Then the screen lit up. At first, the problem looked impossible. It was a nonlinear system with a stability constraint, a recursive transformation, and a final condition that appeared to contradict the opening assumption. The kind of problem that made you wonder whether the people who wrote it had ever been hugged as children. Caleb read it once. Then again. Around him, pencils started moving, then stopping. Owen wrote quickly from the start, setting up a familiar method. Nolan took a different path, breaking the system into cases. Lila began by testing the boundary behavior. Caleb did nothing for nearly 2 minutes. He could feel the old voices waking up around him. "There he goes," some imagined version of Whitmore whispered. "This is where he gets exposed." Grant Hollis was not in the room, but Caleb could still feel the weight of the kind of judgment he represented. The belief that some people belonged here by default and others had to prove it every 5 minutes. Caleb looked at the final condition again. That was the key. It did not contradict the beginning of the problem. It redefined it. The system had been written to make contestants treat the transformation as fixed, but it was not fixed. It was dependent on an invariant hidden in the recursion. Once Caleb saw that, the problem opened. Not all at once, not magically, but enough. He began writing. The first line was simple. The second line made the third possible. By the fifth line, he knew he was on the right path. He could hear movement around him, chairs shifting, paper being turned over, a judge whispering to another judge. At the 30-minute mark, Leela stopped writing and rubbed her forehead. At 40 minutes, Owen crossed out 2 full pages and started again. Nolan was still working steadily, but his face had changed. The relaxed confidence was gone. He had found something difficult, and he knew it. Caleb kept going. He did not rush. That was the difference. The problem wanted panic. It wanted contestants to chase the obvious route until time swallowed them whole. Caleb refused to chase it. He followed the invariant through the recursion, reduced the system, and arrived at a form that looked almost too clean to be right. He checked it once, then again. The answer held. But there was one more step, the proof. He needed to show not only that his solution worked, but why every other path failed. That was the part that mattered. Caleb leaned back for a second and closed his eyes. He thought about all the people who had treated his life like an exception they needed to explain. The scholarship kid, the transfer, the guy from the repair shop, the person who had somehow slipped through the wrong door. They'd all looked for reasons to make his success feel temporary. He opened his eyes and broke the final proof. At 57 minutes, Caleb put his pencil down. The sound was small, but the room heard it. Owen looked up first, then Nolan, then Lila. Caleb did not move. He sat with his hands folded and stared at the screen, not because he was trying to look confident, but because he knew his work was done. A judge stood from the table and walked toward him. The hall became so quiet, Caleb could hear the faint buzz from the lights above. The judge picked up his paper and read it. Her eyes moved slowly at first, then faster. She called over another judge, then a third. Dr. Voss stood from her seat. Caleb saw her look down at the page, and for one brief moment, her expression broke. Not into joy exactly, into recognition. She knew what he had done. The judges huddled together. Nolan was still writing. Owen had stopped, his pencil held in the air. Lila looked at Caleb's paper from across the room and seemed to understand before anyone said a word. The lead judge walked to the microphone. "We have a completed solution," she said. The hall erupted into whispers. The judge held up one hand. "Please remain seated." Khaled felt his heart pounding now, hard enough that he was surprised nobody else could hear it. The lead judge looked down at his paper again, then spoke. "The solution is correct." A sound moved through the crowd, a stunned wave of breath and scattered applause. But the judge was not finished. She continued, "The solution also identifies a structural equivalence not included in the reference method. Mr. Turner has not only solved the problem, he has demonstrated a shorter and more general approach." For a second, Caleb did not understand what she meant. Then the room stood up. Not everybody, not at first. A few students rose, then more, then faculty members, then people in the balcony. Applause filled the hall, loud and uneven and real. It did not sound like politeness. It sounded like surprise breaking open. Priya's voice came from somewhere near the back. Caleb turned and saw her standing beside the side entrance, both hands over her mouth. She had driven to Philadelphia that morning without telling him. Behind her was a security guard who looked mildly confused but had apparently decided not to interfere. Caleb laughed once quietly because of course she had found a way in. Nolan stood from his desk and walked over. He looked at Caleb's paper, then at Caleb. "I did not see that invariant," he said. Caleb nodded. "Neither did I at first." Nolan gave a short, tired smile. "That is the kind of answer people hate losing to." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Why is that?" "Because it is not lucky," Nolan said. "It is just better." Then he held out his hand. Caleb shook it. Owen did not come over. He gathered his papers slowly, his face tight, and left through the side door without looking back. Caleb watched him go and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. More like recognition. He knew that feeling. The feeling of realizing someone had changed the rules of the room without asking your permission. It hurt, but it also gave you a choice. You could learn, or you could leave. At the judges' table, Dr. Voss was still standing. Carl Whitmore sat 2 seats away from her, pale and silent. For once, he did not look amused. He looked like a man whose favorite story had been ruined halfway through. Caleb could see Grant Hollis at the back of the hall now, standing in the doorway. He had come back just in time to hear the announcement. His hands were at his sides, and that expensive gold watch was catching the light. He looked at Caleb for a long moment, then turned and walked out. No dramatic speech, no apology, no final insult. Just a man leaving a room that had stopped agreeing with him. The awards ceremony happened an hour later. Caleb stood on the stage with a medal around his neck and a certificate in his hands. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions. Somebody from a university in California wanted to know what research area he planned to pursue. A professor from Princeton asked whether he would consider applying to a summer program. Caleb answered as best he could, still feeling like he was watching someone else's life unfold from a few feet away. Then Dr. Voss approached him near the side of the stage. She had a paper cup of coffee in one hand. Caleb had never seen her drink coffee before. It made her seem almost human, which he figured was probably unfair, but there it was. She looked at the medal, then at him. "Congratulations, Caleb." This time he could hear it. No trap, no condition attached. Just the words. "Thank you," he said. Dr. Voss nodded. "The department will be holding a review next month about student support, classroom practices, how we handle transfer students and first-generation students." Caleb looked at her. "A review. It is overdue," she said. "That does not mean it will be easy. Nothing worth changing ever is." Caleb studied her face. "And Hollis?" Dr. Voss took a sip of coffee. "Hollis has influence. A lot of it. But influence is not the same thing as being right." Caleb almost smiled. "That sounds like something I should write down." "You probably should," she said. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by noise and congratulations, and the strange afterglow of something neither of them had expected. Then Dr. Voss looked at him and said, "There is one more thing." Caleb waited. "I am sorry," she said. "Not sorry that you proved me wrong. Sorry that I made you prove you belonged before I was willing to see you." Caleb felt the words settle somewhere deep. They did not erase the past. They were not supposed to. but they mattered. He nodded once. "I appreciate you saying it, Dr. Mata." Voss looked like she wanted to say more, then decided not to. Maybe that was growth too, knowing when the person had heard enough. The next Monday, Caleb walked back into applied analysis at Hawthorne University, wearing the same work boots, the same faded brown jacket, and carrying the same backpack with the broken zipper. The difference was that everybody knew his name now. Students who had never spoken to him looked up when he came in. A few nodded. Priya had saved him a seat near the front. Caleb sat down beside her, and she leaned over. "Nice medal," she whispered. "You planning to wear it to class every day now?" Caleb shook his head. "I was thinking maybe the grocery store. Really let people know I'm serious about cereal discounts." Priya tried not to laugh. Dr. Voss entered a minute later. The room fell quiet the way it always did when she walked in, but this time the silence felt different. Less afraid, more watchful. She placed her folder on the desk, adjusted her glasses, and looked around the room. Her eyes stopped on Caleb for a moment. Then she looked at everyone else. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to clarify something about this class." Nobody moved. Dr. Voss rested both hands on the desk. "Rigor is not humiliation. Expertise is not permission to dismiss people. And no student in this room should ever be made to feel that asking a question means they do not belong here." Priya stared down at her notebook. Caleb did not look at her, but he saw her smile. Did not look at her, but he saw her smile. Voss continued, "If I have ever made you feel otherwise, that was my failure, not yours." The room stayed quiet. Not because everyone forgave her instantly, but because people were trying to understand what it meant to hear a person in power admit they had been wrong. Then Dr. May. Voss picked up a piece of chalk and wrote the first problem of the day on the board. It was not easy. It was not supposed to be. But halfway through the lecture, a student in the back raised his hand. Caleb recognized him as one of the guys who had laughed when Caleb first went to the board. The student looked nervous. Dr. Voss turned toward him. "Yes," she said. The student swallowed. "I think there might be another way to approach the condition." Dr. Voss paused. Then she stepped aside from the board. "Show us," she said. The student walked forward, hesitant at first, and steadier. Caleb watched him take the chalk. He watched Priya sit up straighter. He watched Dr. Voss wait without interrupting. And in that small moment, Caleb understood that winning the Meridian Challenge had not been the whole victory. The medal would go in a drawer. The certificate would eventually get framed or lost or buried under bills and old papers. But this, a student raising his hand without fear, a professor stepping back instead of shutting him down, a room learning that intelligence did not need a certain face, a certain school, or a certain kind of permission, this was the part that might actually last. Later that afternoon, Caleb found out Grant Hollis had filed a formal complaint with the dean. He claimed Dr. Voss had acted irresponsibly by sending an underprepared undergraduate to a national competition, and he argued that the department's reputation had been put at risk. The story spread fast. Some faculty members defended Hollis, saying he was only protecting standards. Others said what he really wanted was to protect the old order, the one where people like him got to decide who deserved a chance before the work had even begun. Caleb did not know how the complaint would end. Maybe Hollis would lose influence. Maybe he would not. Maybe Dr. Voss would change for real. Or maybe old habits would pull at her when nobody was watching. Maybe the department would create new policies and call it progress, while some of the same people found quieter ways to keep the doors half closed. Real life rarely wraps itself up as neatly as a competition result, but Caleb knew this much. The next time somebody looked at him and saw only the jacket, the boots, the community college, the wrong neighborhood, the wrong skin color, the wrong path, he would not feel the same pressure to explain himself. He'd spent too long thinking he needed to make people understand him before he could move forward. He did not. He just needed to keep doing the work, because numbers do not care where you came from. A proof does not care where your parents are. The truth does not get smaller because someone powerful refuses to look at it. And sometimes the most satisfying thing is not hearing an apology. Sometimes it is watching the people who underestimated you realize that the world is larger than the one they built for themselves. So here is the question, was Dr. Voss someone who deserved a second chance because she finally admitted she was wrong, or did she only change because Caleb forced her to face the consequences in public? And what about Grant Hollis? Was he trying to protect academic standards, or was he protecting a system that only worked when people like Caleb were kept outside the room? Tell me what you think in the comments, because the line between discipline and cruelty, between high standards and gatekeeping, is not always as clear as people pretend it is. If this story made you feel something, share it with somebody who has ever been underestimated, and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let other people who refuse to let but decide where they belonged.